Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream Fishify podcast. Today I'm joined by Edward Dodge, and he is the author of A History of the Goddess, From the Ice Age to the Bible. Link to purchase this book in the description. In today's topic, we're talking about El and Yahweh, the two gods of Israel. Yahweh and El were originally two separate gods, and several scholars have acknowledged this fact for a very long time. Although some try to make arguments that they were the same God, regardless of the fact that there is evidence showing otherwise. Many scholars are recognizing, and others are coming to the conclusion as well, that they must have been originally two separate gods. So, Dodge, it's been a long time since you've been on the show. Welcome back, and can you tell us a bit about El and Yahweh and their origins and their being originally two separate gods?
Yeah, Jacob, hey, it's great to be back. It's great to be with you. I've taken a little bit of a break from podcasting, so this is my first show back in a little while, but it's great to be here. It's always good to talk to you. So El and Yahweh is two separate gods. It really comes back to the just the basic principle that the Israelites were polytheistic prior to becoming monotheistic. They were a pagan people for a very long time, just like everybody else in the Near East. They were effectively Canaanites. They had the same Canaanite pantheon as everybody else. So El was the high god, the equivalent of On from Mesopotamia, the father of the gods. And we know that this was the God of the Israelites because that's where they get the name. Israel means wrestles with El. And when Jacob, in Genesis gets the name for the first time, the first thing he does is go over to, I'm trying to find the quote here. He goes over to Bethel, the town of Bethel, which means house of El. And he builds an altar, and on the altar he writes the words El Eloi Israel, which means El is the God of Israel, with no mention of Yahweh anywhere. And this is deep in the Bronze Age, or deep in the second millennium at some point. I mean, that's when these stories take place. And there's we have lots of evidence of El. El is a very well known, well documented God from across the Near East. Like I said, the same as On from Mesopotamia. He's the high god above the pantheon, the father of all the gods. And his wife is the mother goddess, is Asherah. That's his mate. That's his spouse. And their son Baal was the king of the gods, just like the Canaanite Zeus, basically, or the Canaanite Marduk. So El, according to various traditions, including the Bible, it says El has 70 sons, or El and Asherah together have 70 sons. And those various sons, the way I see it, are the various kings of the gods in the various communities. So Marduk is one of them in Babylon, and Asherah is another one over in Assyria. Yahweh is one of the many sons of El. Baal is one of the many sons of El. For the Greeks, they describe Kronos as being the equivalent of El, and so Zeus is another one in this line. Indra over in India. So there's a bunch of them, and you can see this pattern repeating over and over again. But El still stays the same. He's always the same guy. He's very distant, and he's very ancient, and he's been around forever. Yahweh does not appear on the scene until much, much later. I mean, El is around the entire second millennium, and he's worshipped all across the Canaanites. He's worshipped by the Hyksos. There's no disputing El's presence in the second millennium BC. Yahweh is nowhere to be seen. I mean, he probably is, in fact, a minor tribal god somewhere. There's various obscure references to that may be Yahweh during the second millennium. But basically, he doesn't even appear in the biblical narrative until Moses. Keep in mind, all the stories we read were written as we read it today. When you read about Abraham talking to Yahweh, it's because the stories we read are written by Yahweh centuries later, where they take the old stories and retroject Yahweh back into them earlier in the historical timeline when he actually would have been there. So when you have Abraham talking to Yahweh in the stories, that's a story written by the followers of Yahweh. But the historical Abraham, such as it were, if there was a historical Abraham, back in around the time of Hammurabi, 1800 BC, is when Abraham would sort of fit on the historical timeline. There's no Yahweh back then. So Yahweh in the biblical narrative comes to Moses at the burning bush during the Exodus, and that's when Yahweh appears on the scene. And the way I see it, this is around 1200 BC, 1250 BC, depending on when you want to date the Exodus. And this is the Bronze Age collapse. This is when Egyptian power is falling apart, when all the powers of the Near East are collapsing, and we enter into a 300-year dark age from basically 1200 BC to 900 BC, when the Mycenaean Greeks collapse, the Hittites in Turkey collapse, all the different cultures. The Assyrians withdraw all the way back to Assyria. The Egyptians are forced to withdraw out of Canaan because they had been controlling Canaan for 400 years up until that point. But this is when Egyptian power, after a series of wars with the Sea Peoples, they are forced to withdraw from Canaan. And this is the point when all the Israelites, not just the Israelites, but this is when the Sea Peoples settle in the Gaza Strip as the Philistines. This is when the Edomites and the Moabites, the kingdom of Edom, the kingdom of Moab, the kingdom of Judah, kingdom of Israel, they all appear on the scene at the same time around 1175 BC, the way in my reckoning, after the second big war with the Sea Peoples. The second big Egyptian war with the Sea Peoples that weakens Egypt enough that causes them to lose control of Canaan. This is when Moses is coming on the scene, and this is the time of the judges in the biblical narrative, when the Israelites go back into Canaan and wage war. And on the historical timeline, what we're seeing is that this is like a couple centuries of complete lawlessness, complete chaos, and is a complete illiteracy. So there's no written records from this time period, from 1200 BC to like 900 BC. There's not much in the way of any kind of writing. And so Yahweh first appears on the scene, I believe, in the context of the Exodus, which I believe was a historical slave revolt, not with millions of people or anything, but enough to be noticed, enough people to be noticed, an entire town or something of that effect. They settle in Canaan. They're followers of Yahweh, but he's just another pagan god. He's just another son of El, and the full pantheon is being worshipped. Baal is the incumbent king of the gods. Asherah, and then there's the three goddesses, Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, who I contend are a triple goddess, that their identities are fungible, their identities are fluid, because it's all part of this big mother goddess tradition that I defend, even if today's scholars don't quite see it that way. So Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, they are the big goddesses. You've got Baal, Yam, and Mot. That's the equivalent of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Yam being the god of the sea, like Poseidon, and Mot being the god of death, like Hades. This is the pantheon. This is how we know it from the Ugaritic texts and the Baal cycle story. And the way I see it is that there was a revolution against Baal, that the Baal culture really did practice child sacrifice, these Molech sacrifices. They used to call them sacrifices to Moloch, but there is modern scholarship has demonstrated there was no god named Moloch. It's just that it's been mistranslated, and it's actually just the name of the type of sacrifice. It's called an MULK because the original Hebrew has no vowels. And this is a sacrifice, a practice that continued all the way into Carthage centuries later, where they also worship Baal, because Baal and El, this whole pantheon is a Phoenician pantheon. And so they took it with them to Carthage in North Africa that was fighting with the Greeks and Romans later on, centuries later. They're worshiping Baal, they're worshiping El, and they are doing these same child sacrifices of the Molech sacrifice. And the Greeks and Romans write about it with the same disgust and contempt as the biblical writers write about it, that they were completely thought that these traditions were quite horrific, and they thought the Phoenicians were pretty gross. So I believe that there was a revolution against Baal, and that it begins only after the establishment of kingship. So you got, like I said, 1200 to 900 BC is the Bronze Age collapse. King David took Jerusalem as a historical event around 1000 BC, 1004, 1006, somewhere in there. Now, scholars will debate whether King David actually existed, but I don't think there's any debate that the Israelites took Jerusalem at this time. And they had a temple there, presumably, whether it already existed or, David and Solomon built it, a temple in the Phoenician style, because they say themselves in the Bible that they are friends of the Phoenicians. So King Solomon is definitely not a monotheist. He is very clearly a pagan, worshiping Yahweh in the pagan manner and worshiping all the goddesses, because the biblical writers are incredibly critical of him for doing so. So here we see, and then the golden calf is also important, because the golden calf is that they destroy after Mount Sinai with Moses, and then again, the golden calf was still there the entire time. Then that is a symbol of these old traditions of El. El is the bull of heaven. That's one of his titles. The bull and cattle are a symbol of the men and the male principle, the male fertility principle, if you will, in these old Neolithic religions. And so you see cattle worship going all the way back to Hayek and earlier, and it kind of represents the male principle. And so the golden calf is this old tradition of El. And so again, there's one in the town of Bethel, and the biblical writers call it Jacob's sin, that they were continuing to worship El. But yeah, they had this old practices, these old pagan practices where the mother goddesses are super strong. So it's got all the sex rituals. The drug and sex rituals are going strong in that era. And there is a revolution against it. So I believe that the revolution kicks in. Historically, it kicks in after kingship. So after King Solomon, after his son Rehoboam, who is also clearly a pagan, the northern kingdom of Israel gets formed. It was pagan its entire history. The biblical writers make no, they point this out repeatedly. Like, they're very unhappy about the ongoing paganism and the evil kings in the northern kingdom. So, and the golden calf stood in Israel. There was two of them, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and they stood the entire time. So El was just continuing to be worshipped on his own as his own independent God, and alongside Yahweh for a very long time. The question becomes for biblical scholars is that we do know that Yahweh and El ultimately get fused into one God, because this is why we have two names of God in the Bible. You've got God and the Lord, because God in English translates back to Elohim, which is plural for gods. And then the Lord, which is always capitalized, translates back to Yahweh. And this is why you've got both words and both names, is because they're originally two separate gods. And you also see the name El all over the place in the text, just used standalone, El Shaddai, aside from these town names. El Shaddai is one of the titles. And so, so El was being worshipped there. So then you've got this revolutionary cult. And at some point, El and Yahweh get fused together. And certainly by the time you get to the written Torah in the Second Temple, they've already been fused. But nobody really knows at what point they've been fused. Biblical tradition maintains that they were fused all the way immediately at the time of Moses. So that would be in the 13th century BC. A lot of traditionalists will assume anyway, that they were syncretized early on. I'm frankly not convinced that they were syncretized early on, or even syncretized in the first temple at all. Maybe they were in the minds of some of the radical Yahwists. That may well be, but it would have been later in the history of the first temple, like after the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah. And it would have only been in the minds of this one small cult, because El was a widely worshipped god all the way through the first millennium. So even if in the minds of the Yahwists, they've fused Yahweh and El, they're just a minority little group in one small country, just in Judah, which is just like a small little place. I personally don't think that they were syncretized early on. I think when you just look at the biblical narrative on its own, you make it pretty clear that they start the reforms in the 9th century. That's when they start overthrowing. There's three queen mothers that get overthrown in the 9th century. So in the 800s BC, the first one is done by King Asa, and this is the beginning of the reforms. I believe he's the grandson or great grandson of King Solomon, and he overthrows Queen Makkah, who was the queen mother, because of her creating a graven image for Asherah. And so she's explicitly overthrown and deposed because of her Asherah practices. A little bit later, it's still in that same century, in the northern kingdom, King Ahab is the leader of Israel. His wife is Jezebel, the most reviled woman in the Bible, Queen Jezebel, the Phoenician queen. And she very clearly is the patron of a temple of Asherah. They make that very clear. They have that battle on Mount Carmel with the prophet Isaiah against the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And Isaiah prevails. This is all during the kingship of Ahab, who is a historical person, mind you. Ahab is a well-attested historical figure. He was an important leader at the time. He's no chump historically. He was a pretty accomplished warrior king. And Jezebel was a historical figure as well. So on the Battle of Mount Carmel, Isaiah, the prophet of Yahweh, or no, it's not Isaiah, it's Elijah. Sorry, get my prophets confused. It's Elijah. He prevails on Mount Carmel. It's a famous story. And then they proceed to kill the 400 prophets of Baal, but they don't mention the prophets of Asherah, who presumably go unmolested because they were still quite powerful. So that is Yahweh fighting with Baal. You can't say Yahweh has been fused with El when he's still waging this coup against Baal, because like Yahweh is trying to become the new king of the gods. He's got to take out Baal first, and then he's going to take Baal's titles. Rider on the storm. He's going to take the title of Lord, because Baal was Lord. It used to be that you said, they talk about this in the book Hosea. The prophet Hosea talks about this, that he says his wife, "You will no longer call me my Baali, you will call me my Ishi." And that was like a Yahwist term, but my Baali means my Lord. Baal was a turn of phrase for Lord that they used all the time, and that they're a common figure of speech and for those folks. So they're using the term all the time. And so Yahweh, the cult of Yahweh, is trying to overthrow this cult of Baal in the 9th century and still fighting with Baal. So I don't think you can make the case that he's been fused with El at this point in history. So King Ahab dies. Jezebel becomes queen mother. Their child is now the king. And there's a coup waged by Jehu, who is a Yahwist. And he assassinates both the kings of Israel and Judah, and he assassinates Jezebel quite famously, has her thrown out of a window. Very famous story in the Bible. And Jehu takes over. And now Jehu is definitely Yahwist. His name, Jehu, as like, I'm not an etymologist, so I'll leave it to others, but that's a Yahweh name. That's got the J, the Jah. That's a Yahweh cognate. So he's a Yahwist, but he's a pagan Yahwist because he leaves the golden bulls still standing, the golden calves in Bethel and Dan. And the biblical writers are very critical of this. They say Jehu, he was a Yahwist, but he didn't go all the way. He didn't really do it right. So he wasn't really a true reformer. But he has a full life, and then his sons are kings of Israel for like a century or something. And so like they just go on being pagan up there. In the southern kingdom in Judah, Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah, had become queen mother. So in all of these assassinations, in all of these political machinations, Athaliah takes the throne. She kills off a bunch of folks. She's like, she's no angel either. So she becomes queen mother in Judah and rules for 6 years, the only woman to rule Jerusalem as a queen in these stories. And then she gets assassinated by Yahweh. So that's the third queen mother, all of whom are associated with Asherah, and 3 of them get deposed. I frankly think that is A, historical, and B, symbolic. Like that, none of that's there by accident. I actually think that these are all real people, and that these are real. That the Book of Kings it's propaganda, but it's actual history. These are all historical figures, and it's actual events being put through the Yahwist propaganda lens, but it's actual history, in my opinion. So that's all in the 9th century. They're still fighting about Baal and Asherah. The Asherah pole continues to stand. And then you get like a full century later, the Assyrians have come through. They wiped out in 722 BC, I believe is the year when Assyria destroys the northern kingdom of Israel and wipes out the 10 tribes, and they disappear. And then they attack Judah. King Hezekiah is now the king, and he's one of 2 great reformers that's all Yahweh, that wants to put down the other cults. And at this point, Assyria is overthrown when he's a young man, a young king. All the refugees come fleeing into Judah. This is a time of great upheaval. And it's a few years later, or even 20 years later, that the Assyrians attack Judah and attack Jerusalem, and they sack the entire country. They totally lay waste to all the towns, and they get all the way to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah is penned up inside the walls of the city, and they lay siege to the city. This is a very important part in the story of the Book of Kings. But ultimately, the Assyrians, they withdraw. Whether they take a huge bribe, they take all the gold out of the temple, and a huge payoff, and decide to depart and leave Hezekiah alive. Now, at this point, if the Assyrians had just sacked the city and sacked the temple of Yahweh and killed Hezekiah, at this point, the entire religion of Yahweh would have disappeared, and we never would have been heard from again. If they had it gotten down to like just one single candle, like literally, like barely anything left of this, what became monotheism. But at this moment, at this particularly crucial moment in time, it was down to just a whiff. But the Assyrians did withdraw. Hezekiah does survive the day, and he's hailed as a hero, hailed as like, the next Moses practically. And so the Yahwists get a big head of steam thinking that they've that they survived, that they were really favored by God. And so Hezekiah, the reforms had already happened. He had led a whole series of reforms. They cut down the Asherah poles and they smash altars to Baal, and they smashed the temple to Baal, and they smashed the Nehushtan. I can never pronounce it correctly, but the bronze snake that Moses had made. This is, again, clear symbolism that the earlier Israelites were totally pagan, because the snake is an incredibly powerful symbol of, particularly in the goddess traditions, of mystical wisdom, power, and authority. But in terms of the goddess traditions, it's a symbol of regeneration. That's why they like it, because their traditions are all about life, death, and renewal. And so the snake is a very powerful symbol, and they had been using it. Moses used a snake staff, and so this had been a powerful symbol for the pagan Israelites, that in the reforms they get rid of it. And this is ties back to the Garden of Eden story, where the snake is turned into something bad, which stands in complete contrast to all the religions of their era, where the snake was highly important and positive religious symbol. So the reforms of Hezekiah come through. Hezekiah lives and dies. He dies an old man, but these reforms were not popular. Hezekiah was popular on a personal level because of saving the city, but these reforms were not popular because as soon as he dies, his son, who I believe is Ahaz, he goes right back to the paganism and brings back the Asherah pole, puts one in King Solomon's temple, and in fact, even I think it's Ahaz. He even goes and goes in subservience to the Assyrians and brings back an altar to Asherah and puts it in the temple of Yahweh. That really upsets the biblical writers. They hate that. So some time goes by, and then you get the second big reformer, which is Josiah, which is in the late 600s BC. So it's like a century later. He's like the grandson or great-grandson of Hezekiah. And it's nearly a century later when Josiah has the second big set of reforms. And these ones have been unearthed by archaeologists. Like, these reforms really happened because the temple of Telerod in Israel that they dug up, this is kind of controversial, but they found, in the Holy of Holies, it's one of the only temples they've ever found that actually matches the type of temple as the temple on the Temple Mount, as the Jerusalem temple. So it's got the same layout, the same tripartite layout, and with the smallest room as the Holy of Holies on the inside. And in that temple, they found 2 standing stones, presumably for Yahweh and Asherah, and 2 incense altars. And they had been carefully laid over and buried, deliberately buried. All this stuff was like, they weren't destroyed in a fight. They were deliberately buried by hand with shovels, laid on their side, not broken, laid on their side and buried. And so these are either from the reforms of Hezekiah or the reforms of Josiah, either one. The carbon dating isn't that accurate. And so, and on one of these altars, the smaller of the 2 incense altars, the one that goes with Asherah, there was incense residue on it that just recently, in the last couple of years, they analyzed that incense and found it to be cannabis. They found it to be hashish. And so that, again, goes back to my whole argument about cannabis being very important to the Asherah traditions, and that this is an actual piece of archaeological evidence, not just textual evidence. So it's very powerful. And it's powerful that it was thrown out as part of the reforms. So at this point, El and Yahweh may be fused. At this point in history, the 7th century, El and Yahweh may be fused in the minds of the Yahwists. But nonetheless, like as I was saying before, still the majority of the people are still pagan. And El and Baal are still being worshipped by the Phoenicians and the Canaanites all around the country. So El had been fighting with Baal to take all of his titles, Rider on the Storm and all those things. And so Josiah gets killed. He wasn't too much favored by God since he gets killed in the battlefield. And then again, the reforms don't stick. As soon as Josiah dies, the following kings all go right back to the paganism. And then it's not much longer after that, the Babylonians come through in 586 and sack Jerusalem and destroy the temple of Yahweh and send everybody in exile, not everybody, but send the elites in exile to Babylon, where they spend the next 150 years. And that it's during that time in Babylon that they put the Torah together. I mean, there's all these old texts and old traditions. And it's during that time in Babylon that they have that once they're the Persians defeat the Babylonians, and the Persians are nice to the Israelites, are favorable towards them, and so they sponsor them to rebuild the Second Temple and to write their sacred texts. And so they're able to employ scholars like Ezra to do the actual scribal work of stitching together the Torah we read today. I don't think it was finished in that time period, but I do think that that's when the traditional dating is 458 BCE is when Ezra, presumably, according to Jewish tradition, brought the completed Torah back to Jerusalem for the Second Temple at the beginning of the Second Temple period. And at that point, they're monotheists. At that point, they're Jews as we know them. But the First Temple, they were never Jews. They don't call themselves Jews. They never use that title. They're either Hebrews or Israelites. There's no rabbis. There's no Torah in the First Temple. So First Temple, all pagan. Second Temple is when they're monotheist. And the transition takes time. But it would have begun presumably at some point during these reforms, late in the First Temple. And then the idea of monotheism really comes together in Babylon. The scholars actually date it. I don't have the passage in front of me, but it's somewhere in Second Isaiah. There's a specific passage that the scholars say is, the first time you really see El and Yahweh having been fused. I'd have to find that passage though. Anyway, I think that's a bit up for me. I can take a break and whatever questions you've got there, Jacob.
We do have a couple of super chat questions. The Muslim apologist, thank you for your super chat. Is there evidence of Yahweh being a distinct God from Elohim? Where does Asherah worship come into the picture?
All right. So Elohim is this. My take on the word Elohim is plural. And my take on it is that means all the gods. And so when they come up with this, frankly, revolutionary idea of monotheism, it's a real intellectual breakthrough in many respects. They take El and Yahweh and they come up with this new word Elohim, which means all the gods. Our God is all the gods. And so, that's dating. I mean, I don't know when they start using that term Elohim instead of El and Yahweh separately, but I believe that is it. That's when they start calling them Elohim. That's when they've been fused together. Now, Asherah worship comes into the picture because she is the popular religion. That is the religion of the common folks. The goddesses are the popular religion, the dying and rising God. These are all the nature-based traditions that seek life, death, and regeneration. And these are really popular religions all across the Near East. And they have a revolution against it. So when they're getting rid of Asherah and the cutting down the Asherah poles repeatedly, and then the people put them back up and the Yahwehs cut the Asherah pole down, this is a reformation. This is a fight. It's kind of like the Protestant Catholic Reformation that played out over centuries in, the Middle Ages in Europe. This reformation, this revolution against the traditional paganism plays out over 4 or 5. Actually, I think it plays out over 2,500 years. But really, in this context, it's 400 or 500 years that they're really fighting about it. And so, right up until the end of the First Temple, when they go into exile, there's a big confrontation between Jeremiah and some of the women. And this particular group has gone into exile in Egypt, not in Babylon, and nonetheless, it's in the immediate wake of the destruction of Jerusalem when they're the refugees. And the prophet Jeremiah castigates the women for their worship of the Queen of Heaven. And the women are like, hey, what are you talking about? No way. This is Jeremiah 44. Everything was fine when we worshiped the Queen of Heaven. It was only when we stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven that we suffered from famine and bloodshed. And they tell Jeremiah to shove it and go away. And he does. And so Asherah was the popular religion. But it's a religion that's full of sex and drugs. It's a religion of the old matriarchies where the women have one of the big things they're fighting about with Asherah, and why this Reformation is in place is because, in my opinion, the argument I'm making in my other work is that Asherah is from the old tribal matriarchies. When you built your families around maternal bloodlines instead of paternal bloodlines, and this was the default for most of humanity, most of our history. In 80-90% of indigenous people, indigenous tribes, and historical tribes are maternal. You trace your bloodlines to the mother. It only makes sense, because to trace your bloodlines to the father obligates you to police the women's sex lives and control the women's sex lives and make sure that the girls stay virgins until they're married, and the women are the wives are monogamous to their men, even though the men are not monogamous at all. And so that is not the default of humanity. The default of humanity is to build your families around the mother's maternal bloodlines. And in those cultures, the women's sex lives are not being policed. And they celebrate women's sexuality. They celebrate women's sexuality as a source of life. And so they have tons of sex traditions. And, the Dionysian and Bacchus cults that came right through Greek and Roman times were all part of this. Dionysus is worshipped alongside Demeter in the Eleusinian mysteries. He's totally gay. And they totally, and it's not just about sex. Sex is part of it. It's about the full cycle of life. So the god will die tragically, and they will mourn. They'll spend an entire day mourning and crying about the god who died. And then the next day, the god is miraculously brought back to life by the powers of the great goddess, and they'll all celebrate. And then they'll celebrate with music and dance and feasting. And ultimately, and drugs is all a part of it. And then ultimately with sex, like they have a great big feast, and then everyone that wants to has sex. And these are celebrations. And if the girls get pregnant, so be it. Like, it's not a problem, because they're not tracking paternity. But if you want to track paternity, you got to shut these old religions down. You can't have these traditions going on there. They completely violate any tenet of paternity. And so this is the era when the Greeks and Hebrews both put these traditions, when they shut them down. Or at least the Greeks reformed them, and the Israelites shut them down completely. But they've got to reorder these old matriarchal traditions to make them fit in a patriarchal context, because by the time we get into the Iron Age, the whole world is shifted into patriarchy. But it hasn't been patriarchy since all of history. Most of human history was matriarchy.
Let's get to the next super chat. Jerichosa, thank you for your super chat. What's the best way to prove El is distinct from Yahweh? The late Dr. Michael Heiser has written that Deuteronomy 32 and some Psalms aren't enough textual evidence. Thoughts or up-to-date resources?
I mean, I would say that it's just that El is like clearly his own god. I mean, El is clearly being worshipped all across the Near East. He predates Yahweh, and he postdates Yahweh, because like the Carthaginians were still worshiping him. He never went away. He never went away. This is the core argument. You can call, the Yahwists can say whatever they want, but not everybody followed Yahweh. Yahweh was a minority cult. Yahweh is totally a minority cult. So what they can have their own opinions about their God. They can syncretize their God with Yahweh if they want to. More power to you. The beauty of paganism is there is no orthodoxy. Every community was free to rewrite the traditions how they wanted to, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be popular or stick around. And it's the traditions that stick around are the ones that you got to pay attention to, because those are the ones that that have like deep meaning for the culture. But just the simple fact that El will continue to be worshipped all across the Phoenician lands, continue to be worshipped right into Greek and Roman times, that the Greeks talk about him. The Greeks say, they write about the Phoenicians and say, they describe El as being the same as Kronos. I mean, they specifically say El is Kronos. And so that's like way after the first temple, like way later. So that's my basic argument. I don't know. Like I said, in the strictly biblical context, we don't know at what point the Yahwist fused El with Yahweh. But the tradition says that the Reformation begins with Moses. I don't actually think there was a religious Reformation in the 12th century. I think the Exodus happened as a slave revolt, but I don't believe there was a religious Reformation until centuries later.
Vesper, thank you for your super chat. What role did Darius I play in Jewish monotheism?
I don't really know who Darius. Darius the First being one of the Persian kings that fought against Alexander the Great. Is that right? That's after.
No. Darius the First was
I don't know.
earlier than Alexander the Great.
Oh,
Much
okay.
earlier.
Is he a Persian king? The only one I know is Cyrus the Great, and then there's a couple that come after Cyrus, because Cyrus didn't actually live that long per se after the events where he takes Babylon, and then his sons continued to be favorable towards the Israelites, but I don't know their names. There's a couple of them though.
So when do you date this Exodus slave revolt that you were talking about?
So my personal pet theory, and this is not the academic consensus, because we've got the Minerva stele, which is 1209 BC, which is the first mention of Israel anywhere in the historical record, the archaeological record, and it's a victory stele by the pharaoh Minerva from Egypt, and he mentioned Israel in terms of defeating them. Says, their seed is no more. Israel's laid waste; their seed is no more. And he also mentions sacking a couple towns in Canaan, in Gezer, and a couple other towns. And so it's clear evidence of a couple things. First of all, that Israel exists at that point, 1209, and also that Egypt was still in firm control of Canaan at this point. So they could not have gone into into Canaan in any kind of major force while the Egyptians were still there. Now there are hilltop settlements, that come identified as Israel hilltop settlements that are there at this point already, but they're still pretty new. So we're talking sometime around 1209. Most scholars are saying it's before that, so 1250 or something. And that 1209 is a mention that they're already in Israel proper. Now, the other oldest piece of evidence we have is textual, and that's from the Bible, and that is the Song of the Sea or the Song of Miriam, which is one of these really oldest passages of Hebrew that comes from the archaic Hebrew that come from the oral tradition pre-writing. And so there's a few of them. There's the Song of Deborah, the Song of Miriam, the Song of Jacob, I believe, is another one. There's a couple of them that are really old, and scholars date them back to this same time period, the 12th century, 1100s BC. And the Song of Miriam is, or the Song of the Sea is it's not very long, and it's the first mention of the Exodus. And it's the only one, it's the oldest passage we have that gives us any details about the Exodus. It's the first piece of evidence, the oldest piece of evidence. And it only gives us a couple of details, but it tells us that there's a military encounter with the Egyptian army, that the Israelites escaped by the skin of their teeth with the divine intervention of Yahweh, that some of the chariots fell in the sea, and that they were able to escape into the desert. So I started thinking about it. Maybe the Song of the Sea and the Minerva stele are referring to the same event. It's just a theory, but the dating works. The dating actually works really, really well. So the Israelites are telling a story that, we escaped we barely escaped. The Egyptian army was ready to run us down. We fled, and we barely escaped by divine intervention and the grace of God. The Pharaoh responds to the same event by saying, I got rid of those guys. You'll never hear from them again. Everybody writes propaganda. Everybody tells their version of events. I kind of see this as two sides of the same story. It's not the way most scholars see it, but I kind of see the Song of the Sea and the Minerva stele referring to the same event, because for a couple of reasons. Like I said, the dating works because it's 30 some years prior to the second war I mentioned, 1175. That's why did they flee into the desert and not go into Canaan for 40 years? Because they couldn't go into Canaan because Egypt was still firmly in control. It's not until this next big war, a generation later, that Egypt loses control. And then all the characters from the Old Testament show up. The Edomites, the Moabites, the Philistines, as I was mentioned, they all show up at the same time. And it's after this second big war. So I really think that time period between the two wars, which is, it's not exactly 40 years, but it's 30 some years. I think the dating works. And I think the idea that Pharaoh his version of events of the Exodus, it's a big enough group of people that he can't not respond. It was a big enough group of people that he did in fact send a battalion of chariots or whatever after them. But something happened. Something happened on the road that the Israelites were able to escape. Things happen. And so, I mean, that's the way I see it. I think it's like, an entire town's worth of people. The Bible says it's 600,000 people plus, all the wives and children and stuff. I take all my numbers in the Bible and take 2 zeros off. So instead of 600,000, it's just 6,000 plus their, wives and kids, like 15,000 people. That's actually that's actually a much more reasonable amount of people. Like that's an entire town. That's a number of people that fit in a basketball arena. I could imagine that. It would be a big enough thing that Pharaoh would be forced to mention it. He couldn't just like ignore it. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I see it. But I don't think it's a religious reformation.
So how long did polytheism continue in ancient Israel before it was completely obliterated?
Interesting enough, there's solid evidence that folks who left Israel continue to be polytheistic up until the Second Temple period, because you've got these Elephantine papyrus from Egypt. Some of the refugees, they went to Egypt and they set up an Elephantine is an island, I believe, right? Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And there's texts from like 300 BC where they talk about Anat and Yahweh, because again, these goddesses, their identities are pretty fungible, so they'll swap Asherah, Astarte, and Anat around pretty endlessly. And this is a tradition. It's called in Hinduism. This is a tradition. It's called Shakti, and it's a super ancient part of the Rig Veda that is still practiced today. In Hinduism, they're very clear that all the goddesses derive from one primeval source called Shakti, and that all the goddesses' identities are interchangeable. And so, especially these triple goddesses. And so that's why I believe you see such easy and ready synchronization among goddesses across the ancient Near East, because people recognize that it's all a common tradition, and it's very, very old and very widely dispersed and very popular.
Do you think that there was a historical Moses that led that slave revolt?
Couldn't say. You can see it being written multiple ways, that he could be a composite character or something. I'm frankly inclined to believe there was a real Moses. I'm inclined to believe there was a real King David and a real King Solomon too. Like I said, I think his identity. One of the things I argue in my book is that the Moses we have, that we read about, would not have been the same as the historical Moses. The historical Moses was a very different character, still pagan, burning ganja, like this whole cloud of smoke thing, pillar of smoke. So I do think that he's got the snake. The shatnets is another thing where he instructs linen and wool to be blended together, but then in the later reforms, they take the linen and wool apart. This is part of the divorce of the mother goddess from the god, because the linen and wool were linen comes from plants, wool comes from the animals, from the farmers and the shepherds. These are these two different groups of people. The old tribal peoples are the farmers. They live in the cities and they have this goddess worship. And the shepherds are these pastoralists, but also the shepherd kings from Mesopotamian traditions, who are these patriarchal ruling class that come and impose themselves on existing tribal populations that were already there. The cities were already there before the kings arrived, like the Uruk and these other great cities from Mesopotamia. They'd been there for like 2,000 years before the first kingship. And so they'd been self-governed under indigenous standards prior to the Bronze Age, and this new class of warrior kings imposing themselves as a new patriarchal ruling class on top of the existing indigenous peoples. And so, and initially, like in the third millennium BC, they're ingratiating themselves. The shepherd kings are ingratiating. You see this in Mesopotamian mythology. They're ingratiating themselves with the people. But over the course of the second millennium, they are, starting to. There's a lot of stress showing between these independent women who are not falling under patriarchal authority. And then in the first millennium, after the Bronze Age collapse, they shut it down altogether, and it goes full patriarchy, and all the women are no longer allowed to have any independence whatsoever. Because in matriarchal tribes, the women own their own homes. So you have matrilocal marriages where the man moves to the woman's house. You see this all over. Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah. Jacob goes and lives with the women's family because this is how they call them bina marriages or matrilocal marriages. This is a marriage where the man goes and lives with the woman's family. And then what happens is, so the women never leave home. They stay with their mothers and sisters and aunties, and they own the homes. They own the property. The generational wealth and inheritance is all passed through the mothers, passed to the daughters. And so I believe that in the second millennium BC, you're having patriarchal tribes and matriarchal tribes coexisting. They're living side by side, but the patriarchal tribes are growing. And eventually the patriarchal tribes take over altogether. But it takes a while. It takes 2,500 years for this whole thing to play out. This is what my new book, this is what I'm working on. And so the I mean, I forgot the original question, but anyway, anyway, I lost my train of thought there.
How long do you think, actually, let me rephrase the question. Do you think that even after they started merging El and Yahweh as the same God, do you think that even way after the texts were written, that some groups resisted that identification? And if so, how long did that resistance carry on before it was eventually dispersed?
I mean, all the Phoenicians certainly didn't agree with it. No, I think that well, here's a perfect example. Here is a perfect example of that. When Ezra brings the Torah back, 458 BC, the date we're putting on it, symbolic date. The scholars will put different dates on, but for the sake of argument, 458 BC. He goes and he reads the book of the law. This is in the book of Ezra in the Bible. He reads the book of the law to the people, and there's a big assembly and everything. He's in Jerusalem now. And then he observes that the men have been marrying the Canaanite women. They've still been marrying the Canaanite women. And he's so upset. He falls to the ground. It's a big, big show, a big history. He tears his shirt and he beats his back and he's crying and putting on this big show of how could you do this? How could you marry these women? I remember thinking this to myself, like, first time I read it, I was like, what is wrong with these women? Like, why do you care so much? And Ezra forces the men, if you're going to be a Jew, you have to divorce these women and leave your women and leave your family. So you have to divorce your wives and abandon your children, or you cannot be a Jew. And from here going forward, you can only be a Jew if you are born to a Jewish mother. You cannot be born to any outside woman. So clearly, at this moment in time, 458 BC, there was still plenty of paganism among the Israelites. But as they consolidate and take on the identity of Jews, they're monotheist. If you call yourself a Jew, you're a monotheist. But everything prior to that, if you're just a Hebrew, that not so much. And if you're an Israelite, it doesn't mean monotheist at all. And so, I'm not a scholar of Second Temple, so I can't say to like what extent there was splinter groups in the Second Temple outside of the one in Egypt that I mentioned. That was definitely still there for a while. I don't really know how long pagan Yahwism continued as a social movement of any recognition. You don't really hear about it in the text outside of that one piece I mentioned. So I don't know. There's so many wars during this time period that there's just one military empire after another coming sweeping through that a lot of folks get wiped out, and it's a very like chaotic few centuries there. So I think by the time the Jews consolidate themselves, they consolidate certainly as monotheists.
And do you think that any memory of El and Yahweh originally being two separate gods had any effect on the New Testament? Do you think there's hints of it in the New Testament at all, in your view?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the whole context of this father-son pattern continues right through with Jesus, just another son of God, just another son of El. So yes, absolutely. And the Gnostics made this abundantly clear. The Gnostics were open about this. They call it the monad and the demiurge. So the monad is the high God, that's El. the one who actually created the universe, but who doesn't actually have anything to do with people because like he's distant and out in space and forming the cosmos and black holes and all that kind of thing. He doesn't have time to deal with his people, little humans. So like that's why he dispatches his children to be the gods that actually, you know, are around with people. But yes, this pattern of the Father and Son, it just continues right through Christianity. And again, the Virgin Mary is just this same pagan mother goddess, but she's been demoted. She's got the same title. She is the Mother of God, the Virgin Mother of God. This is one of the classic tropes of all of these old mother goddess traditions is this whole Virgin Mother title, and that the priestesses were called virgins, the goddesses were called virgins, and that the idea that the entire universe was born of a primordial mother who was all alone, so she had to give birth to her own mate. This is Gaia, and the Greek traditions gives birth to Uranus, but that's not the only one, and they in turn give birth to the next generation of gods. But that's not the only one. In the Mesopotamians, it's Namu, who is the salt waters, who gives birth to everything. That she is the primordial salt waters from which everything else emerges. And her husband is the fresh waters. That's in the Sumerian. Then the next generation, the Babylonians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, they in the Enuma Elish, which is the next, 1,000 years later, they rewrite the story so that Namu has now become Tiamat, but she's bad, and so they have to destroy Tiamat, the old mother goddess. And then there's the waters in Genesis 1, and God created the heaven and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. The waters they've taken the name away, but that is still the same primordial mother goddess, because you'll notice in Genesis 1, God does not create the waters. God creates the heaven and the earth. The waters are already there. Just another little thing. These patterns just repeat over and over again. All the iconography of the baby Madonna and baby Jesus is all repeated iconography from Isis and Horus, which is not to say it's the exact same as Isis and Horus, but they're definitely reusing symbolism and imagery for sure, and iconography. And so, yes, it absolutely goes right through Christianity. The Son of God. I mean, he's just another Son of God. There's been many of them.
B Bear, thank you for your super chat. Do you think the early Upanishads influenced monotheism?
Good question. Above my pay grade. The Upanishads, I'm not sure the date of them. My understanding is that the Israelites in Babylon were heavily influenced by the Zoroastrians. It's not something I've studied a lot because I don't really do Second Temple. I'm mostly focused on the Mother Goddess stuff. But my understanding is that they're directly influenced by the Persian Zoroastrians, and that's where they really develop a lot of the monotheistic theology, like the real hardened theology where it really crystallizes. My understanding that's mostly Persian influence, along with their own ideas. Some of that probably goes back to Egypt and what's his name, the first monotheist there who was worshiping Akhenaten. Some of the ideas probably go back to that.
And in my closing question, when do you think the final form of the Torah came into existence?
It's a good question. I know scholars are debating it, and scholars are pushing the dating farther and farther into more recent history. I'm with Margaret Barker. I do not. I think that the core of the Torah, in terms of the core narrative and the core meaning and the core symbolism, the core spiritual theology of the Torah comes together, in my opinion. And I'm open to other arguments, but this is certainly the tradition. It comes together under Ezra in the 5th century. That said, I do believe they continued to work on it for centuries longer, and there's plenty of good data that they were doing work on it in the Persian period. And then you get Septuagint, which is, what's the date on the Septuagint? 2nd century, 3rd century?
3rd century BC.
Yeah, so that's in the 200s. that's when we know that it's codified into like basically the form we have now. Again, was still like not 100% that way, but like it's basically takes form at the time of the Septuagint. Some scholars are saying that is when it really came together. I don't really like have a horse in that race per se, but things like dating the Song of Songs to like the Persian period, I don't agree. I think that it's a very, very old story that was probably updated in the Persian period, but written originally, just like invented in the Persian period, no way. I don't believe that at all. But updated for sure. Updated for sure.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Edward Dodge.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's been a great talk, and anytime, happy to come back.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.